All right, hello everybody. I get to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics today. So thanks for joining, and hopefully you are game for nerding out with me, um, or at least reluctantly coming along. Steffany Moonaz here. I am a yoga teacher, yoga therapist, yoga teacher trainer, and I am a research scientist. And the focus of my research for over 20 years now has been the use of yoga in the management of arthritis and chronic pain conditions. I'm the research director at Southern California University of Health Sciences, where I am also a professor and have a body of work there with colleagues and collaborators at other institutions using a whole lot of different research methodology. And we'll get into that briefly, but I want to talk to you a little bit about demystifying yoga research to a certain extent. Like anything in life, the more you study it, the more you find. There is no end to the study of research, like, oh, okay, now I get it and I'm done. So I, as a professional research scientist, am constantly learning. And so what I want to offer you is like this tiny little nugget of information that will at least help with, at a first glance, being able to identify some key aspects of a research paper that tell you a little bit about how much you can trust it. Okay, there's a whole lot more to this. And part of the reason why we're doing this live is because we have a 300-hour yoga teacher training that is enrolling now. And the focus of that is on evidence-informed practice, utilizing research evidence in teaching yoga, yoga therapy, advocating for yoga, informing people about it, etc. Using an ethical approach to evidence. And I first want to dispel the idea that choosing an evidence-informed approach to yoga means discarding tradition. If you discard tradition, it's actually no longer evidence-informed, because evidence-informed practice has always, since its inception, even in the field of conventional medicine, had three pillars. Those three pillars are the best available evidence. So in order to apply the best available evidence, you have to know what that means, right? Best available evidence, expert guidance. So expertise, which can be defined in a lot of ways. So expertise can be your own expertise as somebody who has been teaching or practicing yoga for a long time. It can be the expertise of your teachers, your tradition, the expertise that is in source documents about yoga philosophy and practice. So expertise is a really big concept, and it is absolutely essential. If you're not considering expertise, it's not evidence-informed practice. So you've got the best available evidence, expertise, and then the last one is the patient's concerns. The patients, and in medicine, we call it patients. In other circumstances in yoga, we might call them clients or students. It's your stakeholders. It's the people who are actually receiving what you deliver. Who they are matters, what they care about, what they're interested in, what they're willing to do. All of that is essential. So if you're not taking a patient-centered, client-centered, student-centered approach, it's also not evidence-informed practice. Evidence-informed practice, evidence-based practice, the same thing, slightly different connotation. So I'm going to use them interchangeably. But when you're utilizing evidence, it can't be the evidence alone. You don't just take a paper off a shelf and say, okay, students, here's what you're getting today. You take that paper off the shelf, you consider it alongside what you know, what your training, what your experience has taught you, maybe consulting, a mentor, etc. And then you also consider, who are the people here in the room? What do they want? What do they care about? And I'm going to consider the evidence in the way that I bring some of this information in practice to them. So I want to lay that foundation first, that when we're talking about evidence-informed practice, it does not eschew expertise and student-centeredness. It requires it. But you can't have evidence-informed practice without evidence. So what do we even mean by evidence? Well, I'm going to talk today about research evidence. Again, evidence can be a really big concept. There are lots of different kinds of evidence that include observation, right? And observation can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. There are lots of different ways of acquiring evidence. I want to focus on the published research evidence, just for our purposes for today. So when we're looking at the published research evidence, the first thing that I want to say is that the mindset that you approach the evidence with matters. And we could get really metaphysical about that. Observation of something changes it. But one of the questions that we received in advance of doing this live was about how do we find yoga research to support what we're doing? And I would say that's the wrong question. Because if you're looking for evidence to support what you're doing, you've already closed off to the idea that what you're doing should change or could change or might change as a result of the evidence. You're bringing a bias to the literature. You're saying, I've decided what I want to do, and now I'm going to go find the papers that are going to agree with me. And we know from life in modern times that anything that you want to find on the internet, you're going to find it. If you want to be in an information silo where you only get ideas that affirm what you already think, you could certainly do that. I would say that that is an irresponsible and ineffective use of the evidence. What I would suggest is that you go to the evidence with an open-ended question, with an open mind, with something that you're curious about, interested in, and willing to be informed by. So you want to go to the evidence with a question, and there are lots of ways to frame a question. And those of you who decide to go into the training, we're going to spend a lot of time figuring out how do I even ask the right question, because there's this idea of garbage in, garbage out. If you ask the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong information or information that's not relevant or useful. So I'm actually going to share my screen. Somebody asked in the chat, where do we go to find evidence? And so I'm going to share with you my screen. And we're going into, so this is, and I'm in the US, I'm using the National Library of Medicine. It is an incredibly robust database. And so in order to find it, all you have to do is put PubMed in your search bar and it's going to come up. So this is PubMed. So this is what we would call a research database. There are many research databases and different journals are indexed in different databases. So this is the one that I'm going to choose to use. This tends to be mostly health-related research evidence, which is what I'm going to be interested in. If you were interested in mostly psychological research, then you might want to go to another database that's called PsycInfo. But there's a lot of psychological stuff in PubMed as well. Okay, so I actually had this up before. I'm just going to search my research, not to be self-serving, but just because I can talk about my own stuff. I can be critical of my own work publicly more than I want to be critical of anybody else's. Okay, so we're here. We've got 184 papers. So this is every paper that I've been on as an author since I changed my last name to Moonaz. So it doesn't have my older stuff. And that's something to remember if you're ever looking at somebody's body of work, you might be missing things because sometimes people's names change. Okay. So just to orient you a little bit here, you can sort this in a bunch of different ways. You can toggle this so that you're looking at certain years. So I actually started publishing before this, which means that's about when I think my name changed on PubMed in about 2010. Okay, you can look only at things that are available for free, there's a bias to that. And I'll explain that more in the course. We just don't have time to do that now. You can also filter by the type of article that you want to look for. And then there are additional filters. So you can filter by language, and there are more languages than just this. You can look at only humans. You can go, so there are a bunch of ways that you can filter. We're going to look at the whole thing for now. And I'm going to give you 4 things to look at first blush. This is by no means foolproof or a perfect way to evaluate the credibility of a research paper, but it can give you a really quick idea of how credible it might be. Okay. So the 4 things that I'm going to suggest that you look for, one of them, probably the primary one, is going to be the study design. Okay. So there is something called a hierarchy of evidence. And the hierarchy of evidence doesn't mean that some types of research are more important or better than others. What the hierarchy shows you is the risk of bias. There's certain study designs that are just more likely to be biased, depending on how systematic the study design is, right? So, for example, some of you are familiar with the idea of a randomized control trial. A randomized control trial in general has a pretty low risk of bias because you're randomizing people into groups, which means that the groups are going to be about even with each other on most characteristics. And so they're pretty comparable. And the only difference between the groups should be that one got yoga and one got something else. Versus a different type of study design, which might be a cross-sectional study design, where you ask people who practice yoga how healthy they feel, and you ask people who don't practice yoga how healthy they feel. Well, that type of study design is going to have a higher risk of bias because there are a lot of other differences between people who practice yoga and people who don't, besides the yoga, right? And so that type of study design is going to have a higher risk of bias, which means it's going to be lower on the hierarchy. Okay, so actually, why don't I pull up hierarchy of evidence just so that you can see this. And if I go to images, I don't know if this is going to pop up correctly, but you can see that there are different types of study designs that are on a pyramid with things like expert opinion and editorials being at the bottom, case studies, and at the top are systematic reviews, which are going to have the lowest risk of bias. And you could spend more time with that if you wanted to, but it just gives you an idea that there are different types of study designs and they have different risk of bias. So if we're looking at my research here, you can see that this one is an observational study. An observational study is necessarily going to have a higher risk of bias than an intervention. Here's one that's a randomized clinical trial. That's higher on the pyramid. That has a lower risk of bias. Cross-sectional survey, higher risk of bias. People are reporting their opinions. Okay. A pilot feasibility and validation study. So this is actually an intervention, which makes it lower risk of bias, but it's a pilot. And a pilot means it's just testing out a new concept. So that's going to be a little bit less risk, lower risk of bias than something like a cross-sectional design, but a higher risk of bias than a full-fledged randomized controlled trial. So that's your first characteristic, is what's the study design. Your second characteristic is what journal is it published in? And actually, my display options here are the summary. I'm going to change that to abstract. So instead of just seeing the title or the citation, you're actually going to see full abstracts here, right? And that gives you a little bit more information. I want to stress that an abstract is not the paper. The abstract is like a movie trailer. The idea of the abstract is for you to decide whether or not you want to read the paper. You should never draw conclusions from an abstract because it's just a brief summary, right? It's the highlights, like a movie trailer. You wouldn't watch a movie trailer and say, oh, this movie is good or bad because you haven't seen the movie, right? Similarly, you don't have enough information from the abstract to draw any kind of conclusion. That being said, it can give you an idea of what the paper is about. Now, what I said was what you want to look at in addition to the study design And if you're not sure about the study design from the title, you come down to the methods, a retrospective cohort study. Okay, that's the type of study design that this is. But I can also look to where it's published, the journal. This is the Journal of Manipulative Physiotherapy or something similar to that. If I click on this, then it'll take me to all the papers that are written in that journal. Okay. And so what I'm interested in to sort of figure out what the caliber of the journal is the impact factor. Every, or not every, but the vast majority of indexed papers, so papers that are in PubMed, are going to be, there's somebody trying to get in, I'm trying to press admit, are going to have an impact factor. And the impact factor tells you something about how wide the readership is, how many people read this, how much traffic it gets. And the more traffic it gets, it's because the reputation of the journal is higher. When the reputation of the journal is higher, it gets more submissions. And the more submissions it gets, the more discerning it can be, right? It's if you imagine college applications, the colleges that get like, 5,000 times more applications than they can accept are going to be more selective about the students that they accept. And so you're going to end up with a higher caliber of research rigor because such journals just are not or have a high bar for what they are able to accept. So this one, for example, is JAMA Network Open. And so what I can do to figure out, well, what exactly is the impact factor of JAMA Network Open? I can go here and say JAMA Network Open impact factor. And when I do that, it tells me that the impact factor is 9.7. Okay, so that in and of itself probably is meaningless to you. But for contrast, let's look at the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, which is also indexed in PubMed. Um, and if I search for the impact factor there, it tells me the impact factor is 0.7, right? It has a much smaller readership. And quite frankly, it is easier to get your paper into the International Journal of Yoga Therapy than it is into JAMA Network Open. Doesn't mean that the research that's published in IJYT is poor. It just means that the bar is lower than the bar for JAMA Open. Again, we're using like quick and dirty metrics here for what the possible rigor is of a paper. So we have said, well, the study design matters. And we've also said that the journal matters. Honestly, as a research scientist, if I have a paper that I think is really incredible and rigorously conducted, I'm probably not submitting it to IJYT if I believe that it's possible to get it into a higher impact factor journal because I want it to have more of an impact, right? As the impact factor suggests. I want it to have wider readership than IJYT does. Okay, so firstly, look at the study design. Secondly, look at where it was published. And then the third thing to look at is when was it published? Okay, so this paper is 2025. Now, this is not to say that there aren't good papers that were written a long time ago. There's seminal papers, even in our field, that were published a long time ago. And the threshold for rigor has changed, but more than that, the currency, how current the evidence is, has changed, right? So this paper, published just this past year, builds on decades of evidence in this area, right? And as research grows, research is an iterative process. It grows on prior evidence, and we're getting more and more refined in the nuance of the questions that we ask. So that, for example, this paper compares yoga with strengthening exercises for knee osteoarthritis. The reporting quality is higher than the reporting quality was 20 years ago because our standards for reporting quality have improved. By reporting quality, I mean how much detail is in the paper and therefore how useful is it going to be. But even this question of how do yoga and strengthening compare to each other is a question that wouldn't have been asked 20 years ago because we hadn't reached that kind of question in the yoga literature yet. So if I want to contrast this, I can go way down and look at one of my earlier papers, which let's see, yoga in rheumatic diseases. Okay, so this is from 2013. This is a paper that's even suggesting that maybe yoga could be a good idea for people who are living with arthritis. We're so far past that that we're comparing it to the gold standard of physical therapy, right? So when you look at older papers, you're getting older evidence that may not have caught up with what we know now. So another thing that you may want to look at is the date when it was published. Okay. And then the last thing that I'm going to suggest is the sample size. So the sample size is the number of people or the amount of data that is in the data set. And actually, when we go back to this paper here that's spearheaded by my colleague at SCU, Dr. James Whedon, we look here at how much data. So I said, all right, well, this is an observational study, right? So that means it has a higher risk of bias because it's observation of the safety of chiropractic care versus an actual intervention where you're measuring the safety of people who are getting chiropractic care. But when I look at the data set here, look how many patients are included in this data set. Okay, so this is 291,000 patients. That's a lot of data. And the more data you have, the more generalizable that information is going to be to the broader group of people with, in this case, neck pain, older adults with neck pain. Okay, contrast that with this is a randomized controlled trial. So that's a higher level of rigor from a design perspective. However, how many participants are in this paper? Can I even find it? Okay, here we go. 117 participants. Okay, now 117 is actually pretty good for a yoga intervention. Clearly, there's no way you're going to design a yoga clinical trial and have 291,000 people in it. But so the amount of data that we have is going to be much less in a randomized controlled trial. And so there is a weakness there in terms of how much we can generalize this information to other people with the same conditions. Um, just looking at another one here. Some of these are perspectives, which is more editorial, so a lower on the evidence pyramid. Uh, This one is 345, right? So a slightly larger sample size. So that gives you an idea. I'm going to stop the share, let in a couple more people. Okay, so to summarize, what I have suggested so far is that one, you can find, well, the first thing is evidence-informed practice requires a use of the best available evidence, expertise, and patient perspectives, right? Patient, client, student, you have to consider the people that you're delivering it to. Two, approach the evidence with an open mind, not with something to prove. If you go into a conversation with somebody who has a different point of view than you are, and your goal is to prove something, how much are you going to learn? If you go to the research evidence curious, interested, open-minded, you're going to get a lot more out of that interaction. You're going to find different things and you're going to see it differently. Three, there are a few characteristics that you can use to quickly get an idea of the level of rigor of the research that you're looking at. And so those four criteria, having not read the paper, obviously the best way to discern the rigor of a paper is to actually read it and know what you're reading. And if you're interested in that, you're going to enroll in the training. But quick and dirty would be one, what is the study design? Where does it fall on the evidence hierarchy? I do not like that it's a hierarchy because different study designs answer different questions and we need them all. But it does give you an idea of the risk of bias. So what's the risk of bias based on the study design? I also want to just add that within any study design type, there are studies that have higher and lower rigor, right? So for example, an observational study that is incredibly rigorously designed might actually be more important, useful, relevant, strong than something that's higher on the hierarchy, but not as rigorously designed. So Study design is the first. Then we want to look at where is it published. Again, you can find all levels of quality of research in a variety of different journals. But if you look at the impact factor of the journal, higher impact factor means higher bar for getting a paper in there, which means it's going to be looked at with greater scrutiny and it's less likely to get in if it's not rigorously conducted. So the higher the impact factor of the journal, the more likely it's rigorously conducted. That being said, sometimes papers get into high impact factor journals, and us scientists are scratching our head about how that passed through the process. So these are imperfect but useful guidelines. So third is the journal that it's in, and then fourth, the sample size. The more people or the more data points are in the data set, the more generalizable it's going to be. So larger data sets can be more generalizable than smaller data sets might be. Okay. So hopefully that is helpful for just a quick way to be able to assess, is this paper rigorous or not? If you really want to be able to utilize research more effectively, you've got to learn how to be research literate. You only develop literacy by practicing reading something, right? You become literate in your own first language or second language, etc., through the practice of reading. And the same is true of research literacy. You get more literate by reading. And the more you read, especially when you read it with discernment, with curiosity, actively, the more facile you're going to get at understanding it and the more comfortable it's going to be. So that is part of what we will do together in the training, but this at least I hope helps to demystify it to an extent. All right, there's a bunch of stuff in the chat. So where do I find evidence? So as I shared, there are lots of research databases. The one that I go to first is PubMed, but there are a bunch more that you can go to as well, depending on the type of research that you're looking for and how exhaustive you want to be. Where does lived experience fit in with research? That's expertise, right? So, well, it actually fits in two places. So it depends on whose lived experience you're talking about. So I have lived experience of teaching people with 1,000+ bodies and minds, right? So I have lived experience as a yoga teacher that I bring, but my students also have lived experience being a part of the conditioned population. And so when I am utilizing evidence, I am considering the needs, priorities, perspectives of the people that I'm bringing it to. Now, when a research study is designed, and more you will see this, there is consideration of lived experience of the population that's part of that study in the design of the study. And ideally, in the entire process of the study, from the initial proposal all the way to how the findings get disseminated. That approach, broadly speaking, is called community-based participatory research, which means that the members of the community that this research is with, on, about, are a part of the process. So oftentimes you'll see in a paper that there is a community advisory board. There are lots of different names that get used for that, but those are members of the community with lived experience that are helping to inform the way that the research happens. I have a study right now where I'm designing an online yoga intervention for kids with juvenile idiopathic arthritis. We can't design something like that without the input of lots of different stakeholders. We have to know, what are the kids interested in? What are they willing to do? What are they worried about? We have to ask their parents, what matters to you? What are you willing to do? What do you think is important for your child participating in a teleyoga program? And then we also need to ask the providers, the rheumatologists, but also physical therapists, occupational therapists, nurses, PAs who've worked with this population. What are your concerns? What do we need to be careful about? What should we focus on? So we take all of that stakeholder input, and then we're convening yoga professionals who have worked with kids with JIA to say, based on everything the stakeholders told us, how should we design a yoga program that considers what we know, what we have experienced working with this population, right? So our lived experience working with that population. And then we're going to test it out. And when we test it out, we will also ask the participants, what worked, what didn't work? How did it work? How could it be better, right? And so when we talk about research being iterative, it's not just the knowledge that's iterative, it's the process that we use that's iterative. In other words, every study we design better than the one before, not only in terms of the rigor of the science, but the relevance, the feasibility, the acceptability, the effectiveness for the population that we're serving. So a lot of times people have a very closed-minded idea about what research looks like, and it's a power dynamic where the scientist is the expert and they come into the community and they say, this is what you need, or not only this is what you need, but like, this is what we want to test. And so we have the question and we're going to answer it. And you're lucky to participate. And that is definitely not the way that a lot of research happens. None of the research I do happens that way. We go to the community and we say, what matters to you? What are you looking for? What problems do you have that we could try to help solve? How could we work together to build something that might work for you? And then let's test it out and see how it's working. You tell us, we're going to do some measurement. We also want to hear from you what you think about it, and then we're going to do it better and better. And that's how you build a body of evidence that is relevant to and useful to the community that it serves. So hopefully that answers your question about lived experience. How can you search a topic instead of a name? Yeah, okay. That's a fair question. All right, so I can go back into the search. And in the search bar, instead of searching my name, all right, now there's a whole nomenclature for searching, again, beyond the scope of a Facebook Live. So there are Boolean operators that go in between. There, where you put the parentheses matters. There are asterisks. But a really quick and dirty search, I could do yoga and arthritis. Okay, I could get far more specific than that, but just to give you an idea, I could search for all the papers on yoga for arthritis, and then there are 224 papers. And this one, yoga is mentioned somewhere in here, but it doesn't appear to be about yoga specifically. It goes all the way back to 1994. So I could say, okay, I only want to look at the most recent evidence. And then I've got 100 papers. And then I could say, all right, I only want to look at clinical trials. And now I'm down to 15 papers. And this first one is the one that we were just talking about, right? So that would be how you could search by topic. But there is a science to, just as there's a science to coming up with your question, there's a science to how you write this, what's called the search string. Because again, garbage in, garbage out. So if I ask the wrong question, I'm going to get the wrong information. So the way that you put your search term in, the way that you use your filters matters as well. How do I find topics that, and then base that my class? I think you mean, how do you find topics for research that you can then use in your classes when you teach? And so that one was just for, yoga for arthritis, but you could do yoga for balance in older adults, right? And then you would find things that you might want to try beyond just, well, obviously balancing poses, but the how, and you could see which poses they did and why they chose those and what they had to say about how it worked. So there are lots of ways that you could search it that could inform your class. If something is biased, is it bad to bring that research into consideration? No. So when something has a high risk of bias, it just means you have to consider the risk of bias in reading it. So for example, I wrote recently a perspective paper. A perspective paper it's my opinion. And that's like the lowest quality of evidence on the hierarchy, except that my opinion happens to be pretty well informed and well cited. So if you're going to publish a perspective in a peer-reviewed research journal, it can't just be what you think. You've got to actually have a strong rationale for the argument that you're making and grounding it in evidence. So this particular paper is about why I think teleyoga is needed for kids with juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Now, you could look at that and say, okay, well, that's just her opinion. Yes, it is just my opinion. And so you could take that with a grain of salt, or you could say, actually, she knows quite a bit about this. Let me see what her rationale is. What is her thinking? what do I think about that? And then, if I'm going to work with kids who have juvenile idiopathic arthritis, do I want to consider offering classes online based on why she thinks that it's a good idea? Or do I want to wait until there's actually more rigorous research evidence that teleyoga for kids with arthritis is effective? Right? So a perspective is a high risk of bias, but it can still be useful. And the same thing is true moving on up the pyramid. So for example, if we look at a case report that's about one person, that's only one person. Okay, yoga, resolve neuropathy for one person. Okay, great. That was one person. Maybe it'll work for the person I'm working with, and maybe it won't. And do I wait for a randomized controlled trial with 200 people who have neuropathy to decide what I want to do? So, what you want to consider when you're deciding whether or not to apply a certain type of evidence is what's the potential benefit and what is the potential harm, right? So if I use these yoga practices, so I'm using neuropathy as an example because Charlene Muhammad and I actually did publish a case report on somebody whose neuropathy was improved with yoga practice. So if you look at that and you say, okay, I have a student with neuropathy, and this is only a case report, it's only on one person, but I'm going to look at it and see what they did and see if there are ideas in here for things that might be useful. What is the harm of that? Well, the harm of that is that maybe it won't be effective for my student, or maybe my student won't like it, or maybe it will make them feel worse. And so I've got to use discernment in how I apply the evidence to the person that I'm working with, considering what the potential risks are. Generally speaking, we would say, well, risk from yoga is pretty low. But actually, if you look at the evidence, there are some studies that suggest yoga that people get out in their communities can increase their risk of minor resolvable musculoskeletal injury. And so I want to be careful not to do anything that might increase the risk of injury for my students. And therefore, when it's a higher risk of bias type of research, I want to be particularly careful about how I apply it to the people I'm working with. Is there a place where I can learn this vocabulary? Yeah, yeah. Come join our 300-hour yoga teacher training. Okay, so in seriousness, so we are launching a 300-hour yoga teacher training. It's 2 years long. It's a commitment, but by the end of it, you are going to know a lot of things that you did not know. That's not for everybody, and that is totally fine. We are also going to offer a shorter course that is just about research evidence, but that probably won't be available until 2027, if we're being honest. Additionally, I just submitted a manuscript for a book on understanding yoga research. So if you're a DIY kind of person and you want to read the book yourself and go through, there will be some practices to do in there to play with finding research. You could do that. We're also going to start a journal club. And so Journal Club happens at a lot of universities. And the way Journal Club works is that each session of Journal Club focuses on one paper. Remember, I said that research literacy is a skill, and in order to grow it, you have to read. So what I will do in each of these Journal Club sessions is I'll take a paper and I will break down the paper to start introducing some of this terminology. It is an entire dialect. Science is a dialect of English, right? So English is the primary language of science. For better or worse, the vast majority of research is published in English. And science writing is its own particular dialect, right? It has different vocabulary. And if you're unfamiliar with the vocabulary, then you're going to have a harder time reading and understanding. But the way that you learn is by being introduced to the same terms and, looking them up, asking questions, thinking about them. Oh, that's a familiar idea. Just like the way that Sanskrit terminology was unfamiliar to you at the beginning of your yoga journey. And at a certain point, you heard ahimsa enough times that now you don't need to look it up. You know what it is, right? I hope. So the same thing is true with the dialect of research evidence is exposure. Honestly, exposure is the way to do it. So all of the ways that you can expose yourself to it, practicing reading science, and especially with other people who can answer your questions because they have more experience and a firmer grasp of the language. What is the scale for impact factor? Oh, I mean, the lowest would be zero. Actually, there's a certain threshold that you have to meet in order to even have an impact factor. So I know for IJYT, when it first was indexed in PubMed, it did not have an impact factor because it had to be in there and have a certain amount of readership to start with in order to get the impact factor. So there are newer journals that are indexed that don't have an impact factor yet. But the lowest is probably like zero point 0.1. I think IJYT's was like zero point 0.7 or zero point 0.9 or something like that. But it goes up very high, into the double digits for sure, like 30. I mean, it can be quite high, but I don't know if there's a top to it. Most of the integrative health journals are in the single digits. So IJYT is pretty low. If you look at like complementary and integrative health journals, those tend to be in the like, one to nine-ish range. And then maybe if we were looking at rheumatology journals, those would tend to be higher. And then the big ones like Lancet, BMJ, Nature, right? Those are going to have very big impact factors. Can you only submit once? Can you only submit once? I think maybe this question means can you only submit a research study once? So if I'm interpreting that correctly, the answer is no. So what usually happens when you submit a manuscript to a journal, either the editor says this journal isn't a fit for us and we're not gonna review it. So that's one option that sometimes happens. And then you've got to find another journal that believes that your paper is a fit. Or they might say, we're gonna send this out for peer review. They find scientists who have expertise related to that paper and they ask them to review it. So multiple reviewers will read your paper and give you feedback on it. And it can either be accept, reject, major revision, minor revision. Almost every paper is in those two, major revision or minor revision. So almost always when you submit a paper, the reviewers come back and say, change these things, address these questions, strengthen these things, etc. And so you're going to revise your paper, make it stronger, change the rationale, provide more data, clarity, etc. And then it goes back to the reviewers, right? And sometimes it's multiple rounds of that, making the paper better and better before it finally gets accepted. And then it goes through copy editing with the team before it gets published. Sometimes the peer reviewers will say, this is not, the rigor is low and we don't think that this is worthy of publication. And then either you do something to strengthen the science or you take it to a lower impact factor journal. So I don't know that I've ever had a paper that I wasn't able to publish anywhere. But I've definitely been on teams where they wanted to publish in a really high impact factor journal. Actually, the one comparing yoga and strengthening, we shot really high to start with, and then we had to come down a little bit. And it's still in JAMA Open, which is really good. So hopefully that answers that question. Do we have any other questions? Either those of you who are here in the Zoom or Kylie, anybody in the Facebook thread have any other questions? Okay. And Kylie put the link to the training, the 300 hour on here in the Zoom. I'm sure she also put it in the Facebook thread. And if you have additional questions, please let me know. If you have questions about the 300 hour, about the book, about the research course, about the journal club, any of those, happy to answer them. And as you can tell from my enthusiasm, I feel really passionately about bringing discernment to how we offer yoga, especially to clinical populations. We have a lot of growing evidence about how yoga can be incredibly effective in helping to alleviate symptoms and manage disease. Any of you who are here probably know that yoga is a practice of transformation. So far more than how it can help with symptom management, I believe that it is possible to completely change the way that we live with these conditions, the way that we think about what pain management even means. Life with chronic pain. What are we even talking about? I think there is so much that yoga has to offer there, but we have to do it in ways that are safe and appropriate, feasible, acceptable, accessible to the people that we're offering it to. And when I'm delivering a yoga intervention in, with veterans or with children or in a school, in a federally qualified health center, in an opioid treatment program, online to people in their living rooms. Like it can't be just copy and paste. It's got to be appropriate for the people that you're bringing it to, which is in the service of yoga. It's seeing the humanity in the people that you're bringing the practices to, and bringing your own humanity to that, right? Our own expertise is a lot of different things. Expertise is intuition. Expertise is like felt sense and our the energy that we bring to the work that we do. So I think that we can use this amazing science that we are that is providing us insight into how these practices work and use it to deliver yoga to people in ways that are going to serve them the most. So, thank you for being here, for considering, what can sometimes be a scary topic for people because it's unfamiliar and therefore a little bit intimidating. So I hope I've helped to dispel it a little bit, and I hope you'll stay engaged with it going forward. Thanks so much.